Welcome to Windy Night Stories. Tonight's story is by Penelope Fitzgerald, The Axe. You will recall that when the planned redundancies became necessary as a result of discouraging trading figures shown by this small firm, in contrast, so I gather from the company reports, with several of your other enterprises, you personally deputed to me the task of speaking to those who were to be asked to leave. It was suggested to me that if they were asked to resign in order to avoid the unpleasantness of being given their cards, it might be unnecessary for the firm to offer any compensation. Having glanced personally through my staff sheets, you underlined the names of 4 people, the first being that of my clerical assistant, W.S. Singleberry. Your actual words to me were that he seemed fairly old and could probably be frightened into taking a powder. You were speaking to me in your democratic style. From this point on, I feel able to write more freely, it being well understood, at office managerial level, that you do not read more than the first 2 sentences of any given report. You believe that anything which cannot be put into the first 2 sentences is not worth attending to, a piece of wisdom that you usually attribute to the late Lord Beaverbrook. As I question whether you have ever seen Singleberry, with whom this report is mainly concerned, it may be helpful to describe him. He worked for the company for many more years than myself, and his attendance record was excellent. On Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, he wore a blue suit and a green knitted garment with a front zip. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, he wore a pair of gray trousers of man-made material which he called my flannels, and a fawn cardigan. The cardigan was omitted in summer. He had, however, one distinguishing feature, very light blue eyes, with a defensive expression, as though apologizing for something which he felt guilty about, but could not put right. The fact is that he was getting old. Getting old is, of course, a crime of which we grow more guilty every day. Singleberry had no wife or dependents, and was by no means a communicative man. His room is, or was, a kind of cubbyhole adjoining mine. You have to go through it to get into my room, and it was always kept very neat. About his things, he did show some mild emotion. They had to be arranged in a certain pattern with respect to his in and out trays, and Singleberry stayed behind for 2 or 3 minutes every evening to do this. He also managed to retain every year the complimentary desk calendar sent to us by Dino's, the Italian cafe on the corner. Singleberry was, in fact, the only one of my personnel who was always quite certain of the date. To this, too, his attitude was apologetic. His phrase was, "I'm afraid it's Tuesday." His work, as was freely admitted, was his life, but the nature of his duties, though they included the post book and the addressograph, was rather hard to define, having grown around him with the years. I can only say that after he left, I was surprised myself to discover how much he had had to do. Oddly connected in my mind with the matter of the redundancies is the irritation of the damp in the office this summer, and the peculiar smell, not the ordinary smell of damp, emphasized by a sudden appearance of representatives of a firm of damp eliminators who had not been sent for by me, nor is there any record of my having done so. These people simply vanished at the end of the day and have not returned. Another firm, to whom I applied as a result of frequent complaints by the female staff, have answered my letters but have so far failed to call. Singleberry remained unaffected by the smell, joining, very much against his usual habit, in one of the too frequent discussions of the subject. He said that he knew what it was. It was the smell of disappointment. For an awkward moment I thought he must have found out by some means that he was going to be asked to go, but he went on to explain that in 1942 the whole building had been requisitioned by the Admiralty, and that relatives had been allowed to wait or queue there in the hopes of getting news of those missing at sea. The repeated disappointment of these women, Singleberry said, must have permeated the building like a corrosive gas. All this was very unlike him. I make it a point not to encourage anything morbid. Singleberry was quite insistent, and added, as though by way of proof, that the linoleum in the corridors was Admiralty issue and had not been replaced since 1942 either. I was astonished to realize that he had been working in the building for so many years before present tenancy. I realized that he must be considerably older than he had given us to understand. This, of course, will mean that there are wrong entries in his cards. The actual notification to the redundant staff passed off rather better, in a way, than I had anticipated. By that time everybody in the office seemed inexplicably conversant with the details, and several of them, in fact, had gone far beyond their terms of reference. Young Patel, for instance, who openly admitted that he will be leaving us as soon as he can get a better job, taking me aside and telling me that to such a man as Singleberry, dismissal would be like death. Dismissal is not the right word, I said. But death is, Patel replied. Singleberry himself, however, took it quietly. Even when I raised the question of the company's early retirement pension scheme, which I could not pretend was overgenerous, he said very little. He was generally felt to be in a state of shock. The two girls whom you asked me to speak to were quite unaffected, having found themselves employment as hostesses at the Dolphinarium near here. Mrs. Horrocks, of Filing, on the other hand, did protest, and was so offensive on the question of severance pay that I was obliged to agree to refer it to a higher level. I consider this as one of the hardest days' work that I have ever done for the company. Just before his month's notice, if we are to call it that, was up, Singleberry, to my great surprise, asked me to come home with him one evening for a meal. In all the past years, the idea of his having a home, still less asking anybody back to it, had never arisen, and I did not want to go there now. I felt sure, too, that he would want to reopen the matter of compensation, and only a quite unjustified feeling of guilt made me accept. We took the Underground together after work, traveling in the late rush hour to Clapham North, and walked some distance in the rain. His place, when we eventually got to it, seemed particularly inconvenient, the entrance being through a small cleaner's shop. It consisted of one room and a shared toilet on the half landing. The room itself was tidy, arranged, so that it struck me, much on the lines of his cubbyhole. But the window was shut and it was oppressively stuffy. "This is where I bury myself," said Singleberry. There were no cooking arrangements, and he left me there while he went down to fetch us something ready to eat from the steak-a-rama next to the cleaners. In his absence, I took the opportunity to examine his room, though of course not in an inquisitive or prying manner. I was struck by the fact that none of his small store of stationery had been brought home from work. He returned with 2 steaks wrapped in aluminum foil, evidently a special treat in my honor, and afterwards he went out to the landing and made cocoa, a drink which I had not tasted for more than 30 years. The evening dragged rather. In the course of conversation it turned out that Singleberry was fond of reading. There were in fact several issues of a color-printed encyclopedia which he had been collecting as it came out, but unfortunately it had ceased publication after the 7th part. "Reading is my hobby," he said. I pointed out that a hobby was rather something that one did with one's hands or in the open air, a relief from the work of the brain. "Oh, I don't accept that distinction," Singleberry said. "The mind and the body are the same." "Well, one cannot deny the connection," I replied. "Fear, for example, releases adrenaline, which directly affects the nerves." "I don't mean connection, I mean identity," Singleberry said. "The mind is the blood." "Nonsense," I said. "You might just as well tell me that the blood is the mind. It stands to reason that the blood can't think." I was right, after all, in thinking that he would refer to the matter of the redundancy. This was not till he was seeing me off at the bus stop, when for a moment he turned his gray, exposed-looking face away from me and said that he did not see how he could manage if he really had to go. He stood there like someone who has tried to give satisfaction. He even used this phrase, saying that if the expression was not redolent of a bygone age, he would like to feel he had given satisfaction. Fortunately, we had not long to wait for the 45 bus. At the expiry of the month, the staff gave a small tea party for those who were leaving. I cannot describe this occasion as a success. The following Monday I missed Singleberry as a familiar presence and also, as mentioned above, because I had never quite realized how much work he had been taking upon himself. As a direct consequence of losing him, I found myself having to stay late, not altogether unwillingly, since although following general instructions I have discouraged overtime, the extra pay in my own case would be instrumental in making ends meet. Meanwhile, Singleberry's desk had been cleared, that is, of the trays, pencil sharpener, and complimentary calendar, which were, of course, office property. The feeling that he would come back, not like Mrs. Horrocks, who had rung up and called round incessantly, but simply come back to work out of habit and through not knowing what else to do, was very strong without being openly mentioned. I myself half expected and dreaded it, and I had mentally prepared 2 or 3 lines of argument in order to persuade him, if he did come, not to try it again. Nothing happened, however, and on the Thursday, I personally removed the things from the cubbyhole into my own room. Meanwhile, in order to dispel certain quite unfounded rumors, I thought it best to issue a notice for general circulation, pointing out that if Mr. Singleberry should turn out to have taken any unwise step, and if in consequence any inquiry should be necessary, we should be the first to hear about it from the police. I dictated this to our only permanent typist, who immediately said, "Oh, he would never do that. He would never cause any unpleasantness like bringing police into the place. He'd do all he could to avoid that." I did not encourage any further discussion, but I asked my wife, who is used to social work, to call round at Singleberry's place in Clapham North and find out how he was. She did not have very much luck. The people in the cleaner's shop knew, or thought they knew, that he was away, but they had not been sufficiently interested to ask where he was going. On Friday, young Patel said he would be leaving, as the damp and the smell were affecting his health. The damp is certainly not drying out in this seasonably warm weather. I also, as you know, received another invitation on the Friday, at very short notice, in fact no notice at all. I was told to come to your house in Suffolk Park Gardens that evening for drinks. I was not unduly elated, having been asked once before, after I had done a rather awkward small job for you. In our company, justice must not only not be done, it must be seen not to be done. The food was quite nice. It came from your caterers, grade 3. I spent most of the evening talking to Ted Hollow, one of the area sales managers. I did not expect to be introduced to your wife, nor was I. Towards the end of the evening, you spoke to me for 3 minutes in the small room with a green marble floor and matching wallpaper leading to the ground floor toilets. You asked me if everything was all right, to which I replied, "All right for whom?" You said that nobody's fault was nobody's funeral. I said that I had tried to give satisfaction. Passing on toward the wash basins, you told me with seeming cordiality to be careful and watch it when I had had mixed drinks. I would describe my feeling at this point as resentment, and I cannot identify exactly the moment when it passed into unease. I do know that I was acutely uneasy as I crossed the hall and saw 2 of your domestic staff, a man and a woman, holding my coat, which I had left in the lobby, and apparently trying to brush it. Your domestic staff all appear to be of foreign extraction, and I personally feel sorry for them and do not grudge them a smile at the oddly assorted guests. Then I saw they were not smiling at my coat, but that they seemed to be examining their fingers and looking at me earnestly and silently, and the collar or shoulders of my coat were covered with blood. As I came up to them, although they were still both absolutely silent, the illusion or impression passed, and I put on my coat and left the house in what I hope was a normal manner. I now come to the present time. The feeling of uneasiness which I have described as making itself felt in your house has not diminished during this past weekend, and partly to take my mind off it, and partly for the reasons I have given, I decided to work overtime again tonight, Monday the 23rd. This was in spite of the fact that the damp smell had become almost a stench, as of something putrid, which must have affected my nerves to some extent, because when I went out to get something to eat at Dino's, I left the lights on, both in my own office and in the entrance hall. I mean that for the first time since I began to work for the company, I left them on deliberately. As I walked to the corner, I turned and saw the 2 solitary lights, looking somewhat forlorn in contrast to the glitter of the Arab American Mutual Loan Corporation opposite. After my meeting, I felt absolutely reluctant to go back to the building, and wished then that I had not given way to the impulse to leave the lights on, but since I had done so and they must be turned off, I had no choice. As I stood in the empty hallway, I could hear the numerous creakings, settlings, and faint tickings of an old building, possibly associated with the plumbing system. The lifts, for reasons of economy, do not operate after 6:30 p.m., so I began to walk up the stairs. After one flight, I felt a strong, creeping tension in the nerves of my back, such as any of us feels when there is danger from behind. One might say that the body was thinking for itself on these occasions. I did not look round, but simply continued upwards as rapidly as I could. At the 3rd floor, I paused, and could hear footsteps coming patiently up behind me. This was not a surprise. I had been expecting them all evening. Just at the door of my own office, or rather of the cubbyhole, for I have to pass through that, I turned and saw at the end of the dim corridor what I also expected. Singleberry, advancing towards me with his unmistakable shuffling step. My first reaction was a kind of bewilderment as to why he, who had been such an excellent timekeeper, so regular day by day, should become a creature of the night. He was wearing the blue suit. This I could make out by its familiar odine, but it was not till he came halfway down the corridor towards me and reached the patch of light falling through the window from the street that I saw he was not himself. I mean that his head was nodding, or rather swiveling, irregularly from side to side. It crossed my mind that Singleberry was drunk. I had never known him drunk, or indeed seen him take anything to drink, even at the office Christmas party, but one cannot estimate the effect that trouble will have upon a man. I began to think what steps I should take in this situation. I turned on the light in his cubbyhole as I went through, and waited at the entrance of my own office. When he appeared in the outer doorway, I saw that I had not been correct about the reason for the odd movement of the head. The throat was cut from ear to ear, so that the head was nearly severed from the shoulders. It was this which had given the impression of nodding, or rather lolling. As he walked into his cubbyhole, Singleberry raised both hands and tried to steady the head, as though conscious that something was wrong. The eyes were thickly filmed over, as one sees in the carcasses in a butcher's shop. I shut and locked my door, and not wishing to give way to nausea, or lose all control of myself, I sat down at my desk. My work was waiting for me as I had left it. It was the file on the matter of the damp elimination, and, there not being anything else to do, I tried to look through it. On the other side of the door, I could hear Singleberry sit down also, and then try the drawers of the table, evidently looking for the things without which he could not start work. After all the drawers had been tried, one after another, several times, there was almost total silence. The present position is that I am locked in my own office and would not, no matter what you offered me, indeed I could not, go out through the cubbyhole and pass what is sitting at the desk. The early cleaners will not be here for 7 hours and 45 minutes. I have passed the time so far as best I could in writing this report. One consideration strikes me. If what I have next door is a visitant which should not be walking but buried in the earth, then its wound cannot bleed, and there will be no stream of blood moving slowly under the whole width of the communicating door. However, I am sitting at the moment with my back turned to the door, so that, without turning round, I have no means of telling whether it has done so or not. The end.